All right. Well, with that, I am going to dive right in. So thanks so much for having me. I am really enjoying the nature of the content here. I think what's starting to come across really clearly is that this general topic of sustainability carries much more complexity than maybe we all expected. And hopefully we are all leaning in to really what that complexity means and how brands of all sizes and companies of all sizes can start to navigate this. It was really with that in mind that I decided to put this presentation together. I think there's sort of the familiar narrative around sustainability and biotech, and of course I'm going to talk a little bit about that because our company does have a big biotech portion to what we are doing. But I also thought it might be interesting to talk about us as a new company in the beauty space. We were formed just 8 months ago, and as we are standing ourselves up, we are asking ourselves questions around this topic of sustainability. And I thought it would be useful to share the perspective of a young company and how we are navigating this and thinking about building pillars around this. So I come to you with humility and making very clear that I and we make ourselves out to be absolutely no expert on this topic, but this is an honest attempt of a group of highly technical scientists that are trying to do this topic right as we are standing up our business. And so I'll share really where we are learning, the things that have surprised us, and what we see as the next steps that are ahead of us. So you've probably been seeing headlines that look something like this, right? Is biotechnology the answer to a more sustainable beauty industry? Is lab-grown material the answer to all of our sustainability woes? And just as a simple backgrounder, I thought it might make sense to talk about why we hear so much of this in relation to biotech. So first, we need to have an understanding of traditional sourcing methods. And I apologize if this is so pedantic for many of the people on this meeting, but as we were standing up Arcaea and we were gathering investment in our Series A, I was actually surprised at how many people within the industry thought that they understood generally why biotech is looked at as a potential avenue for more sustainable solutions, but how little they understood about exactly why that was. So I make no assumptions about how much people know, but just to share a basic overview here, through traditional sourcing methods, right, you have your source, which could be something derived from a petrochemical, a plant, or an animal. Of course, in some cases, these are waste streams that we're dealing with. And then there's an extraction process that takes place, and it depends on what the material is, whether it's coming from an animal or a plant, or the specific type of plant, or if it's coming from a petrochemical. This extraction process typically involves temperature, both hot and cold, and pressure, and a series of steps and chemical reactions to end up with ultimately the ingredient at the end that you can formulate into your finished product. And so obviously in each of these cases, there are considerations around sustainability. Case in point, most of the industry you hear is moving towards natural, right? We were just hearing about that in the previous presentation. Natural is not necessarily always better, and what we see the industry doing is shifting more and more towards plant-based sourcing. But actually several years ago at a conference, there was someone from a very prominent multinational that got up on stage and said, hey, if our whole company shifted our entire supply chain to plant-based sourcing, the earth could not grow enough plants to be able to sustain our whole supply chain. And so in our perspective, this is going to be a very real tipping point for the industry. Plants are not going to be the solution. And as consumers start to ask for things to move away from petrochemicals and animals, what is the alternative? And so, of course, with each of these, even with plants, you have land usage, you have water usage, and traceability is coming up as a challenge. A couple of anecdotes that I heard as I was doing research in the raw material space. I spent about 2 years studying the value chain of the industry and understanding how different decisions are made across that whole value chain. And a great example of a story that I heard was around a plant that was increasing in popularity. And there was a time where companies could source the plant from a very specific farm. But as that plant grew in popularity, that farm couldn't actually service all of those needs. So multiple farms needed to be created in different geographic regions. And this created a problem. It maybe solved the supply issue, but the different geographic regions didn't have consistency in their production. Simply because the climate was maybe just that little bit different. It was affected by climate change just that little bit more. And so ultimately the end product was not consistent. And so what the company started doing was they started blending together all of these different sources to sort of homogenize and to create an equal type of extract. This became actually very problematic as brands are now saying, okay, well, I want full traceability. I want to understand the exact farm that this plant came from. And of course, that is now impossible because effectively you're taking multiple sources and you're mixing it into one. So how does this contrast with what biotech is basically all about? With biotech, you're taking some sort of a feedstock, for example, a sugar or something like molasses, and you're feeding a microbe. And you're taking that through fermentation and then processing that through a downstream process to end up with your ingredient. So this is different because people are very excited about engineering these microbes to produce a lot of different things, right? Infinite possibilities, basically. And then the efficiency of this process is significantly more improved, right? So 5 orders of magnitude minimum, less water, land usage significantly less. You're still using a feedstock, so right, you still need to be careful about that. It's not like switching everything to biotech is going to solve all of our problems. But people are really excited about this because it is much more efficient, being documented as much more efficient. But we have to be careful with some of the decisions that we make as we set up this process. So for that reason, you hear a lot about biotech as a sustainability solution. And you hear a lot about biotech as kind of this different way to make things. And of course, that's exciting, right? You see companies like C16 that is developing a biotech version or a biotech alternative to palm oil. By the way, palm oil and that whole crisis is actually kind of an interesting side effect of the shift to plant-based. So as consumers are saying we don't want anything from petrochemicals, the other way that they were able to find kind of similar attributes that were just as flexible as like the long carbon chains in petrochemicals was in palm. And that's of course created a humanitarian and a sustainability crisis. So plant-based is not always better if we aren't thoughtful with how we plan that process. But you have great companies like C16 that are trying to develop biotech alternatives to this. But the way that we look at this at Arcaea is, okay, biotech can be used as a way to make the same things we know, but much more sustainably. So we can take something that is problematic in the supply chain and come up with a much more controlled, consistent method of making this that requires less land, less energy usage, and less water. But what we got really excited about at Arcaea was basically asking ourselves, well, what if biotech isn't just a utilitarian tool for manufacturing? Because in reality, when you look at all of the tools and technologies that have emerged over the last 2 decades to enable biotech, it's all about tools that are about understanding, looking at, and harnessing biology. And what if all of those tools could be used as a creative tool? What if we looked at fermentation as a new creative tool? What if we looked at DNA sequencing and DNA writing as a new creative tool? What types of product performance and new functionality and even product stories could we unlock? And what if we could start to tap into entirely new things? And oh, by the way, they happen to be more sustainable. And so this is sort of the direction that I try to explain Arcaea as doing, where we are not developing one-for-one replacements of existing ingredients. Our belief is that will keep the industry on the current trajectory that it is on, right? Making the same things but different. The industry is going to look literally exactly the same. But I get really excited about all of these new tools that haven't been heavily integrated into the infrastructure of beauty and personal care, and how we can start to play with those to create new types of product possibilities and new types of functionality, while simultaneously, as a byproduct, as sort of like a de facto table stakes, being more sustainable in the process. But the sustainability portion is is more table stakes rather than the objective of the whole thing. And I'm going to walk you through a few examples of what I mean by that later in the presentation. A little bit more about why we're viewing these tools in this fashion, and what I mean by this like esoteric comment of like biology as a creative tool. The products that we have today have been shaped by the technical tools that we have, right? If we think about how formulation stacks for all of our products are constructed, it is because it is based off of the tools that we have today. I started a brand called Mother Dirt, and we had a live probiotic that we were looking to bring to market. And I saw firsthand how powerful biology was, but there were no tools to be able to work with it. There were no ingredients that we could formulate with a live probiotic. In terms of method validation for how you measure performance of something with a live metabolism, those tools definitely didn't exist. Manufacturing tools to be able to produce a monoseptic product. Basically, you want to manufacture something with a bacteria, but only the bacteria that you want. That was completely different and a challenge to the industry. And so, our products, the products that we see today, have been shaped by the technical tools, largely those focused around industrial chemistry, that have been evolving over the last 200 years. And when I think about what biology presents and all of these new technologies that have matured over the last 20 years, so I talked about it as DNA sequencing, DNA writing, fermentation, bioinformatics, the microbiome, a new understanding of microbiology, protein design, and protein engineering. These are tools that are not something that is familiar to the industry today, and actually quite a shift for them to integrate as seamlessly as we would expect. And so I think about introducing biology as a tool, not to replace it, right? This isn't an antagonistic relationship, but really as a way to enable new possibilities. And so like a super cheesy way that I demonstrate this is through this tree of life visual, right? Where we look at all of the different types of natural molecules that exist. And really today, when consumers think about natural and when we think about where ingredient sourcing is going, it is compressing itself in this like pizza slice of plants. And when we look at all of the natural molecules that exist, all of like the gifts of nature, if you will, it is much more expansive than just plants. But we're not able to tap into these because it would have ethical or sustainability related issues. But now, having like the code of life, right, being able to understand DNA, now we can start to tap into anything within this tree of life ethically and sustainably. And so some of my favorite examples to give here are around the very problematic category of UV filters. So problematic from a regulatory standpoint, concerns around safety, and also environmental issues that have come up with all of this. Like consumer trust around this topic has largely been eroded, and there's so much confusion here. But interestingly, fish have potent UVA and UVB filters, but the conventional method of sourcing in the industry would be to, harvest these fish and to like extract this molecule. That's that, if you remember that first slide of traditional sourcing. But obviously that's not ethical, so the industry cannot and will not do that. But with biology, all we need is the ability to read DNA code, and we can do that now. And we can read that code and say, okay, where is this organism told to make this molecule? And then we take that snippet, we stick it into a brewer's yeast or whatever other chassis strain is appropriate, and we start to make that molecule, and then we can study it, validate it, and even improve upon it. And so an example like that is just a small example of how we can start to tap into new types of possibilities. And this is really where Arcaea is focusing. Arcaea is not focusing on replacing palm oil. Arcaea is not focusing on replacing, plant-based ingredients that are feeling a pressure, right, in terms of renewability. We are focusing on creating new types of possibilities. And the sunscreen or the UV filter example is one of the examples of the way that we think. And this is all around this theme of expressive biology, which we talk about. We believe that the future, if we integrate biology as a tool, that we will be using our biology as a way to be able to express ourselves. And I'm going to give you an example of what that means. Think about every amino acid in your hair as being something that is harnessable for your self-expression. This is a perfect example of the new types of how we can harness the new types of technologies that have evolved today while simultaneously fulfilling sustainability needs and requirements. So one of the interesting things that I learned probably over the course of 2 years, like 2018 to 2020, I was talking to a lot of hair care experts and hair care scientists, and this theme started to come across about how in the 80s and 90s, scientists were fascinated by hair structure. If you think about hair as a material, right? They were really interested in hair from its material properties. The things that we put our hair through, it's pretty resilient, right? We wash it almost every day. We use surfactants on it. We use styling products on it. We heat it. We also put it through treatments, right? It's sometimes harsh treatments like coloring or straightening. And scientists, and hair is pretty resilient, right? It generally stays on our head. Think about doing those same things to a t-shirt that you wear, right? It's kind of gross to think about, but a t-shirt that you wear every single day and you put it through the same types of things that you put your hair through. Well, hair is really resilient, right? It stays on our head. It looks like it is intact. Of course, we damage it here and there, but scientists were very intrigued by how does the hair do that? And so they became very interested in keratin proteins. Keratin proteins make up about 95% of our hair. And they were really interested in understanding what is so special about these proteins and how they are put together and what they are doing that makes them this resilient. And if we understand that, then we can start to do really cool things with that information. But this was in the 80s and the 90s. And at that time, the tools to do this had not matured, and they certainly were not accessible for the beauty and the personal care industry. To give you an example, understanding protein 3D structure is like one of the really critical things to being able to answer some of those questions that they were asking. But there were 2,000 protein structures that had been identified and developed by 1999. So that is how nascent that category was. And so what ended up happening? Scientists decided, hey, this is really hard. Keratins are really hard to understand. They're super complex. And so we can't do anything there. So instead, all of hair care science shifted to surface chemistry and surface phenomena for the large part. And that has shaped hair care formulations for the last several decades. And so the core understanding here is how can we make your hair feel from a surface standpoint a certain way rather than changing something about the keratins, right? Rather than biologically starting to impact anything internally. And so at Arcaea, we actually get really excited about going back to those same questions that were being asked in the 80s and 90s, but with a whole new slate of tools to be able to create different solutions. So how does this affect sustainability, right? First of all, this is a hard problem. The fact that keratins are really complex and complicated, that definitely hasn't changed. But we have a new way to be able to understand them and to create new possibilities. So I think traditional, sustainability, biotech perspectives would say something like, oh, well, keratins today are animal sourced. So let's create a fermented version so that there's a vegan version of keratin. And of course, that is still helpful in terms of sustainability objectives. But again, biology as a creative tool, what if we started to tie protein design to performance, right? And we're creating a whole palette of keratin. So not just one that's vegan, but actually delivering foundational new innovation to consumers with new types of things that the hair can do. And so I'm showing you actually a scene from our lab here when we closed our financing. We were trying to order hair tresses, and because of supply chain issues, they were hard to come by. And I actually chopped off my own hair, part celebratory, but part to be able to start doing some method validation and some SOPs in our own lab. This is a texture analyzer and some of the equipment that we have in our lab. And we are already working with a recombinant keratin proteins in our lab to see if we can start to tie different types of like amino acid sequences to performance attributes. And so this is what I mean by expressive biology. And this is a different way that we view sustainability as something that comes along the way, but sort of taking it to a whole new level. So very focused on performance. So, now bringing it back to the original kind of prompt and question here. So what does it mean to be a company that is this young and to be developing a sustainability strategy, right? So is it enough for us to just sort of say, okay, well, our technology, de facto is likely to be more sustainable than traditional methods. So I don't know, we'll start thinking about it when we move into production. Where do we start? We innately felt uncomfortable with that sort of thesis, right? Let's start to think about it when we enter commercialization, which is going to be down the line in the future. And so we started looking at, okay, well, what are other companies doing? Which sounds like a pretty reasonable place to start. And we did do some of that work, and I'm going to share what some of our learnings were. But one of the things that we realized was all of these companies already exist. They have products in the world. And so they're talking about the reduction of certain things, right? And the reduction of emissions. But we are at a different place, right? We're very, very young. We are just starting. We have no commercial activity to date. And so innately developing a sustainability strategy for us needs to sort of be tailored to that. And so what our team decided to do is to actually work with people who are experts in this space. We did not feel comfortable figuring it out as we go. We wanted to have people around the table to help guide us. And we were really fortunate through our advisors and some of our employees to be connected with some professionals in this space. And so we ended up working with a third-party consultancy called Planet Friendly, which is a great punny name. And we are actually currently in progress of working together with them to develop our sustainability strategy. And we expect that this is going to be something that we're going to have to continue to develop and work on for many, many years to come. But where did we start? So we started with the question of how do we define world-class sustainability standards? Who is doing an exemplary job here that we would strive to be like or strive to model ourselves after? Who can we learn from? What are some patterns and pitfalls that we could identify? So we started off with a landscape assessment. And the prompt here for the landscape assessment was to take brands and companies across the entire value chain and to see what we could learn from all of them. And so the third-party consultancy actually did this research for us. We developed a list of just under 40 companies, and we wanted to see if there were any patterns that emerged from that. And very interestingly, there was this one distinct pattern that emerged around purpose-driven language and vision statements associated with sustainability, right, as sort of a core part of their objectives and company objectives. And then the robustness of their strategy and specifically the scientific measures that they were using. And so funny enough, it fell into these super neat quadrants. I think part of this is driven actually by the dynamics of the value chain. So some of it is probably not surprising, but there were some core themes that emerged. And I share this just as something that was really interesting and telling for us. And I also want to share parts of it that were actually very inspiring and exciting for us. So you see that, companies that have strong purpose-driven and strong purpose-driven language and vision statements around this topic are more consumer-facing, right? So these are both the large CPGs and the indie brands. They are interfacing with the consumers directly, and they know that this is really important to people and to consumers. Suppliers are not as consumer-facing, and there are other methods that they are accountable for presenting to their customers. So whether they're indie brands or global CPGs, that are a little bit more utilitarian. So maybe the language is not as important, but it's starting to show up in some of their marketing language, and I'll share some of that in the future. And then biotech is actually really early on in all of this. So, less of purpose-driven language, again, because most biotech is deeper in the value chain. And biotech is actually still figuring out, I think, its ESG strategy and measures, also because several companies in the space are on the younger side. So I thought that pattern was pretty interesting. Here's some other takeaways. So a lot of text on here. I did try and digest some of this down, and if whether you believe it or not, actually this is a much digested version of the initial report that we did here. But a couple of key themes that I wanted to bring across for the multinationals, the raw material suppliers, and the indie brands. So the first bucket that we wanted to look at was, okay, well, what frameworks are people using, right? So there are some globally recognized frameworks. Are they science-based? How are they measured? What are the reporting structures that are involved? And so multinationals and raw material suppliers are really strong here, and not surprisingly. And they're like public-facing statements around what objectives are that they need to reach. Indie brands definitely have a lot of positive language, but the frameworks don't come through. So there was only one brand, at least in the data set that we had covered, that mentions mapping scope 3 emissions. Scope 3 emissions are basically like, for those that don't know, again, this was new information for me as we started to embark on this work, but effectively these are emissions that are indirect to the company, right? So like further down in the company's supply chain that are maybe not owned in any way by that company. And so people for biotech in particular are very excited about the impact that biotech can have on scope 3 emissions in particular. But I just wanted to point out that Beautycounter was the one brand of all the indies that had language around mapping scope 3 emissions, but there wasn't a publicly available or committed to framework, whereas multinationals and raw material suppliers generally, they're saying like these are the frameworks that we're following. It's either the UN or the GDI. We'll talk about some of those in the future. And here's how we're measuring those things, and here's how we're reporting on them, and here are our goals. And so they're very sort of clear cut around that. Again, I want to point out that these companies, the multinationals and raw material suppliers, they are more mature companies, so they're typically like older. Several of them are public, right? So they have to report to shareholders. So there's like a whole different set of expectations for them. What else do I want to call out here? So packaging, is sort of brought up across each of them. And then, in other, you start to hear more about deforestation and bio-based and biodegradability. And indie brands, conversely, they focus on what they feel like they can control a little bit more. So local sourcing is an area of more interest for them. Now, for biotech companies, for the ones that we looked at, and admittedly, again, you saw that our sample size was just under 40, and I think we had 4 or 5 biotech companies that we looked at, so I'm just flagging that our sample size is small. But of the ones that we did look at, Amyris was the only one that did formal ESG reporting, and I think their first report was published in 2021, which was a retrospective on 2020. And they look at several industry standard targets, but now we see more claims starting to emerge around energy, feedstock sourcing, things like that. But I do want to point out that a couple other things that we're seeing is that these companies in this space are starting to prioritize this. So not only is it indicative that Amyris published their first report, but Amyris is part of this like UN compact. Zymergen is hiring a VP of sustainability. Checker Spot, which is another company in the biotech space that works with algae, I believe predominantly. They just got a B Corp certification. Genomatica up here, published a paper on a full life cycle analysis of their butylene glycol. So this area is starting to mature and evolve as well. So what did we learn? How did we end up defining, that question that we set out to answer, which is like, okay, well, what is best in class? How would we define that as a startup, something that we can aspire to and grow towards? So one is some sort of long-term vision statement around this topic. 2 is setting really clear targets and also having very clear reporting frameworks. Third is being holistic, right? So also looking at not just climate, but waste management, land use, and water stewardship. Water stewardship in particular will be really important for biotech, right? And then supply chain footprint, consumer impact, and social responsibility. So those are kind of like the 6 factors that we had decided, like, okay, these are the things that we feel we need to be able to address to say that we have a comprehensive sustainability plan that is part of our company's DNA. And so as a next step, what I thought we could do was share with you, like, okay, well, where do we start? Now that we've defined that these are the things that are best in class, where do we start? Our team is still pretty small, and I will admit it was actually very overwhelming to have the readout of this report. This report underscored, the complexity of this entire topic. And so we just want to take it bit by bit, right? So where are we as a company starting? And I want to be pretty transparent around this and also share some of the resources that we're going to be using, because we are, of course, not the only young company in this space that is really, that finds sustainability to be a really important part of what they want to do. So I'm going to take you through just a couple of these, and I'm also mindful of time, so I'm going to move pretty quickly, but I think these are pretty quick to move through. So first is doing a materiality assessment. Some of you might know what this is, but actually I didn't know what this was until we started doing this work. So a materiality assessment defines all of the different components that can have a significant impact on the activities of the company, and on the ability for that company to create value for itself and its stakeholders. And so basically you're ranking things on, like, okay, how does it impact all of my stakeholders, and what is the significance of that impact? And actually one of the best in class ones that we have seen is from Unilever. And so you can find that yourself. But effectively what we're going to be doing is working together with all of our stakeholders. So for example, Gingko Bioworks is a partner that we work with on a few of our programs. And so in this case, we would be sitting down with Gingko and talking about these things as we develop our materiality assessment. 2 is developing reporting and targets. So this is an important part of accountability. So here we want to use a globally recognized reporting framework and set of standards. It's going to lead to more credibility for us, but actually the more important thing is for us to know if we are actually making an impact, which is the thing that we care about the most. So GRI is one of the most regarded ones, and we have to tailor things for our business, right? So reduction of targets doesn't mean as much to us because we don't have commercial activity. So maybe we're talking a little bit more about being net zero or net positive from the beginning. And then also we probably need to tailor things based on our business growth timeline. So maybe we look at 2030 as like a big a goal and timeline for us. And maybe in the interim, we're looking at our in-house footprint. So right now we're building out a lab, and actually the architects and the interior designers that we are working with, we have an entire meeting scheduled to talk about sustainability. And so maybe interim, that's really where we focus, but then as we start to commercialize product, that starts to expand. And product design. For anyone who has developed products, they are probably very familiar with the Stagegate process. And so what we are going to be doing is integrating sustainability objectives into every part of the product design cycle and into every part of the Stagegate, so that we can be much more effective at doing a life cycle analysis when a product is on market, but also so that we can design with that in mind. So Cradle to Cradle is a common company that's referenced in this place, in this space. And then real fast, supplier engagement. So in some cases, we are going to have suppliers that we work with ourselves. And so we need to be able to get information from them to make sure that they align with our objectives, particularly around the Scope 3 emissions. And so there are 2 resources here, the Carbon Disclosure Project and EcoVadis that are great resources to be able to provide this information. So this is where our team is now, and as you can see, we have a lot of work ahead of us, but we are really excited to see what we can do here, and I hope that, if anything, that this was really helpful for all of you. And that is it.